I'd like to call to order this regular meeting of the Boulder Valley School District Board of Education for Tuesday, October 21st, 2025. Board members may attend in person or by electronic means in accordance with VSD policy, BMEA, and state law. Laura, can you please call the roll?
Chavez.
Here.
Medler. Niznik.
Here.
Quinlan Awada.
Here.
Rajpal.
Here.
Sargent.
Here.
Unger.
Here.
Thank you.
I'd like everyone to turn their attention to the screens for our land acknowledgement this morning.
The Boulder Valley School District resides and operates on land that is the ancestral homeland and unjustly and illegally taken territory of the Ute, Puebloan, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Apache, Navajo, and 48 other tribal nations historically tied to this land, who have called this land home since time immemorial. We acknowledge the atrocities committed here, including the painful history of genocide, forced assimilation, and efforts to alienate the indigenous inhabitants from their homeland, supported by the policies of the United States government. BVSD is aware of the many indigenous peoples, past and present, and their dignified nations and cultures who care for this land with strength and resilience. BVSD recognizes the histories of the land in Colorado and the survival of many nations that carried their oral traditions into the present. It is BVSD's responsibility to educate ourselves, our community, and our students so that we can embrace the wisdom and knowledge of indigenous peoples and actively stand together to address injustices. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm and honor the history, wisdom, oral traditions, and resilience of indigenous people, and recognize the responsibility to care for and appreciate this land together.
I'd like to remind everybody that the mission of the Boulder Valley School District is to create challenging, meaningful, engaging learning opportunities so that all children thrive and are prepared for successful, civically engaged lives. Thank you so much for joining us here in person today and observing the meeting remotely. We're glad to have you with us. At this time, is there a motion to approve today's agenda? Moved by Kitty, seconded by Beth. Laura, can you please call the roll?
Chavez.
Yes.
Medler. Niznik.
Yes.
Quinlan Awada.
Yes.
Rajpal.
Yes.
Sargent.
Yes.
Unger.
Yes.
Motion passes.
We have one topic today, which is a work session on declining enrollment. Board members, I will turn it over to Rob to do the introductions. Before that, I just wanted to, because we have Alex remotely today, I think what I would like to do is after every section of the presentation, we pause. We can go around the room, include Alex to ask any questions or to provide comments or feedback, just so we can kind of keep that flow moving a little bit better with the remote participant. With that, I will hand it over to Dr. Anderson and Rob Price for introductions.
Good morning, Board President Rajpal, board members. Excited to have our conversation today around long-range planning. I'm going to turn it over to Rob for a second just to introduce folks, and then I have a few slides to go through before I turn the presentation over to Rob Price.
Good morning, board. I just want to do a few introductions. Joining me today, Glenn Segru, our senior planner, Robin Fernandez, assistant superintendent of schools, and then our two chairs, Jeff Anderson, our co-chair, and Beth Solis, our chair from our long-range advisory committee. So thank you all for joining us today.
So board members, as we think about setting the context and the stage for our conversation today, first and foremost, talking about declining enrollment has been something that I think that this board has been doing proactively for the past 4 years. We started by identifying the problem. We started, and Rob's going to go through this in a minute, all of the steps that we've taken since 2022. And I do want to highlight the proactive nature in the way that we have been addressing this and looking at this problem. And it's evolving differently, and in some ways the same than we anticipated it would 4 years ago. We'll talk a little bit about that. But as we want to define the problem and define our goals as we think about addressing declining enrollment and what we're going to do today, for our school system, we certainly want to first and foremost maintain and improve learning outcomes for all students. Our district has never been performing at a higher level than it is today, and we want to make sure that any decisions that we make, whether it's declining enrollment, budget, staffing, that we know and understand that that's what we wrap out first and foremost altogether for all students within our strategic plan. We want to be able to think about strategies and ideas that help us distribute students, and so all schools have the right level of students and resources to maintain high quality learning experiences so we can continue to improve outcomes for all students. We'll talk a little bit about that and what that can look like. We want to make sure that we're stabilizing our enrollment by retaining current students, but we also want to make sure that we're creating the conditions for new students to come join us, and whether that's students that are currently living within our district in homeschools, private schools, other options, or even districts, parents who are driving into our community or parents who live outside of our community. But we also have this underlying scenario that we talk about maybe as much as we talk about declining enrollment, which is the ongoing fiscal challenges, not just in K-12, but here within our school district. And because of those, we're going to be making sure that any decision that we make, we have to maximize the efficiencies so we can continue to have the dollars to invest in our kids and in our schools. And I think that as we define the problem and what we're going to talk about today, framing this up, we feel like that those are really what it is that we're going to be focusing our efforts on today as we talk about where we are and potentially looking at what you had asked in the spring, which is, and I think that this is the right question, and I don't think the board is the only one asking this question. I think some folks in our community as well. Are we moving fast enough? Are we thinking broad enough? Right? Do the systems that we have today, where we're really looking at a single school at a time, will that get us to a place where we'll continue to be proactive enough that we get ahead of problems before we have a crisis on our hands, and that we're thrown into some of the scenarios that we've seen other districts across the country, across our state, where they're trying to balance the budget by closing schools. And that's a really, really difficult place for a school district to be in. So, continuing to be proactive. I know these are conversations that LRAC has had as well in regards to when and how do you look at this broader, and we're going to kind of frame that up for you all to have that conversation today. Just a reminder for the board and for the public, yes, we are declining in enrollment, but we're also achieving incredibly high levels. Levels that not only this district has never seen, but any district on the Front Range has ever seen. The year that we had last year, the growth and achievement that we're seeing, not just from our kids that are already doing well, but from our most vulnerable populations of students, our multilingual learners, our students who are served with IEPs, our students on free and reduced lunch, their growth and achievement is at rates that not only outperforms their peers, they're like peers in other districts, but is the best performance we've ever seen as a district. And so it's a huge celebration to know and understand, and something that we want to continue to go back to. And it's really this theory of action, board members and for the community to know that we've really focused on creating the right, meaningful opportunities for all kids. That's created the growth for all kids that's helping us raise achievement. If you were to look at the underbelly of how we're continuing to get better as a system, it's because our most vulnerable kids are doing better. And that's intentional, and that's taken a lot of hard work to get there. And so we're really proud of that. So, setting the stage, we have an opportunity today, I think, to have a really meaningful conversation. I want to thank everybody who's here, who's joined us for this conversation as we think about, what additionally do we need to do beyond the LRAC metrics and process that we have today to begin to think about proactively addressing some of these issues before they become a situation where we're forced to make really tough decisions in a short time frame. And in my experience, that just doesn't go well. And so I'm excited that we're having this conversation today while we're not in a crisis situation, but we see it coming. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Rob Price.
Board, you have seen this slide, I believe, a number of times now, but it does a nice job of illustrating the work that we have completed since 2022. As a reminder, as Dr. Anderson mentioned, the proactive approach by the board to put the Long Range Advisory Committee together, solidified that in board policy. And then the work that continued. As you know, we just completed the work of changing attendance boundaries. That was our first 5-year review. Just wrapped that up. And then tomorrow night is our third BBSD is the place to be showcase, and then continuing this discussion. I do want to say with the Long Range Advisory Committee, this timeline really illustrates the work of the board, the work of the district, and the work of LRAC. But as we move forward, we continue to focus on the outcomes of these meetings, the direction that we receive from the board, and then we are continuing to focus on the middle level metrics. And we'll talk a little bit about middle school metrics later on in the presentation. I just want you to know that is a focus. We started that work last year. We're continuing this work this year with the hopes of wrapping that up by the end of this school year. And with that, I will turn it over to Glenn Segura.
Do you want to advance this one? Oh. So good morning. We will begin by looking at a slide that we have seen before, both in the boardroom and at Long Range Advisory Committee, that serves as the backdrop for the beginning of this conversation today. And what it really is the progression of our past state, our current state, and our possible future state in terms of looking at the number of rounds that we have in each of our elementary schools, with the definition of a round being a class. So a school with 3 rounds at one grade level means that there are 3 classes at that grade level. So back in the day, and not actually that many years ago, when I first started at the Ed Center about 10 years ago, the vast majority of our elementary schools had 3 rounds or even more at each grade level. Therefore, our structures for FTE allocation, our special schedule known as the ABC schedule, and allocations for full-time FTE that you see on the far left-hand side of this slide were created to support what was the reality for the vast majority of our elementary schools. So if we fast forward to our current state, we have only 10 elementary schools in the district that have 3 rounds-ish, meaning they have either 3 rounds at each grade level in all grade levels, or the majority of their grade levels have 3 rounds, but some might have 2. And then when we move a little further to the right on this slide, that represents where the majority of our elementary schools are now. 18 of our elementary schools have 2 rounds-ish, meaning that either all or the majority of their grade levels have 2 rounds, or they might have a grade level or 2 with 1 round or 3 rounds. And again, we have, as you look toward 1 round, we have 2 schools that are more or less 1 round, where they have the majority of their grade levels at 1 round, but might have 1 that has 2 rounds. Not included in this calculation are Gold Hill, Jamestown, or our charter schools. So this means that the majority of our elementary schools now have the adult structures that are bulleted under round, 2 round, and 1 round schools. Despite this, our 2 round schools are outperforming what our 3 round schools ever did. So this is determined by the school performance frameworks and really speaks to the work of implementing a strategic plan that is student focused, despite the fact that we continue to navigate the adult structures as enrollment has continued to decline in our elementary schools. A complicating factor, however, is that our staff and community continue to expect the 3 round structures that we are all accustomed to, in our schools that have experienced declining enrollment to the point where we have either 2 rounds or 1 round at each grade level. And so expectations have remained consistent despite declining enrollment in those schools. So as I shared, most of our schools have a combination of number of rounds. For example, there might be 1 or 2 rounds or 2 or 3 rounds in different grade levels within the same school. And the complexities that half rounds create lead to a couple of grade levels at some schools, sometimes leading to multi-age. So this year, 11 of our elementary schools received multi-age FTE that they then worked collaboratively with their teachers to decide how to distribute, whether they would multi-age or their teachers would departmentalize and focus their specialization in that way. So as time passes, and most of our elementary schools are projected to continue to decline, our schools will be moving further and further to the right of this slide. So as we continue to focus on on student needs in our schools, we do also continue to look for solutions to navigate the evolution of our adult structures as we balance that with needs of students in declining enrollment.
Just one comment, board members. I think this is an important slide as we think about communicating to our community what's up for tomorrow. And I think, Robin, you captured this really well, that the expectation, community expectation, may be, regardless of how many kids are in my school, right, that I expect to have all of the things that come with the number of students, right, that would support what used to be in a 3-round school, right? So, and it's people, right? And it's full-time versus fractions of people, right? The smaller you get, the more traveling teachers, teachers have to cover 2-3 schools. That happens today. It's happened more and more over time. Even the idea of the ABC specials rotation being a thing. We had an MOU with BVEA because that doesn't even feel realistic anymore. Instrumental music is something that we still have, right? But that at a certain point, I don't know that you can sustain that, right? As something that people have come to expect, right? If you do nothing and let all of your schools get smaller. Right. The idea that every elementary school can have one dedicated counselor, right? That going to a half counselor, a quarter counselor, right? Somebody a couple of days a week. These are the types of things that if there isn't any conversation around doing something differently, this is what will inevitably happen in schools. And it's hard to communicate that in ways that everybody hears, right? We've been talking about declining enrollment for 4 years, but those are the types of things. Now, the scheduling complexity and limitations, you could get to a place where schools lose the ability to set their own schedule, and we'd have to set it because we have to maximize our people across schools. And so then that could be a different scenario, a way that we could think about this. But inevitably, the more schools you have, right, smaller numbers of students, now there could be benefits to that, right? There's small, intimate schools, and there's benefits to that. But the other things that folks have come to learn to feel like is going to always be there, won't be there. Just to be really, really clear, we can't spend money we don't have. We've been screaming from the rooftops around funding in Colorado. I spend every year at the legislature during legislative session for a solid 6 months telling this story to as many folks from our delegation and other elected officials across the state, the issues and challenges that this can occur. So knowing and understanding that today it might be okay. Right, when you start to see the projections 5 years from now, right, it's just a very different experience, and we have to have a conversation about that. So
board members, before we head into the data, any questions about programmatic, operational outcomes-based information at our schools. Lelania.
So I very much appreciate that we're talking about student impact. Yes, yes. But what I do see on this slide that I would like to talk about a little bit more is impact to teachers. I'm not a teacher, not been a teacher. Some board members have, but I'd like to understand as you become a single teacher for your grade or a teacher of multi-grade or even 2 rounds, how that affects you. Because I think we need to also, during this discussion, be thinking about how we're taking care of our educators.
It's a great question. If you get down to 1 round, it's really hard. It's hard because if you have kids who probably don't, for whatever reason, should be in the same classroom, right? There's nowhere within the school for them to go. I think as a teacher who's, in like master schedule terms, they call it a singleton, or just, somebody who is the only person in a school who teaches a thing, it's really hard to collaborate. The more rounds you have, the better you can differentiate, right? If you're regrouping kids and you're doing some ability grouping or things of that nature, that becomes a much logistically something easier to do. Traveling teachers are less efficient. So if we are having to compensate teachers to move around the district, right, you have to compensate them for that, right? Like they don't go off the clock when they get in their car to go somewhere else and go back on the clock. That's just not how it works. And so we're still paying them as if they were teaching the entire day in one school, but we're able to be, depending how far they have to drive, they teach less sections. So your inefficiencies go up the more traveling teachers that you have. I think that, as we started talking about this, the 3-round school, I think for the teacher experience is probably, it solves the most problem. It solves problems that the other models don't solve. Anything to add on that, Robin? Sorry, I'm just going to be jumping in here, so.
No, I guess the only thing that I would add is that there is an impact on climate and culture and sense of community with the, as we have more and more teachers within one school needing to travel, the collective sense of not just instructional collaboration, and especially when we think of new curricular materials that we are implementing and the need for teachers to be able to work together on making sure that we are implementing those materials with fidelity. But then that sense of who we are as a school and where do I belong and where do our students belong. So there is also an impact in that sense.
Okay, as I alluded to before, we're going to kind of whip around the table. So we'll go Kitty, Jason, if you have anything, Alex, and work our way around.
Okay, so I have 2 questions. 1, do we pay mileage to our teachers who travel? Okay, thanks.
Yes.
I say for the record, Robin was nodding. And are there any elementary schools in which students will go from teacher to teacher at some levels for subject matter? Because I know that happened when my kids were in school, but they're millennials.
Yeah, so departmentalization is something that's happening probably at more of our schools today than it happened previously as a response to these, 2.5, 1.5 rounds that the FTE has provided. And so that's a way where, the expectation, I have one teacher all day long, they teach me everything. Departmentalization is one of the ways that you can adjust to be able to distribute the students in ways that allow them to not be a multi-age classroom.
I want to ask about specials. As a parent, I think it's one of the things I'm most grateful for with our district is just the level of specials and the quality of the teachers. And you said, the ABC rotation model is probably not realistic going forward. I mean, not that I don't want to focus on those words, but more like, what does it look like in our 18 schools that are 2 rounds and 2 schools that are 1 round, operates that? I mean, if this is the future, I think it's important to understand what that really important piece of our curriculum and our offerings, what that looks like for other schools.
Yeah, I'll let Robin speak to what's happening today. You know, and I just to clarify, right? The 3 round, if you do nothing else, right? The 3 round is a thing of the past until birth rates come up or somehow it becomes more affordable to live here. Right. Of which we don't really have control over. I just want to be really clear, the community. Those are aspects of that we have to live within. So I'll let, to my knowledge, kids in 1 round schools are still getting their electives. It's just much less efficient to be able to do that because there's more travel, there's less sections to teach within a school.
The other complicating factor is when we do have specials teachers that travel, very often the master schedule is driven by the availability of those teachers, as opposed to the teaching and learning needs that really should drive the master schedule. And so that is an issue. In addition, we know that in a 3 round school, we are able to schedule a common plan time for all of our teachers. So as I said before about the importance of having a common plan within 1 grade level, that becomes increasingly challenging, if not impossible, as we have fewer. And so to that end, we have been collaborating with BVEA and a focus group of principals that have been working to figure out how it is that we can accomplish common plan, accomplish specials in terms of the student experience continuing in a way that we know and expect and value. And so we are experimenting this year with a couple of different structures with the hope of finding something that really does work moving forward, that we can use as not our 3 round model anymore, but our 2 round model in a different configuration of classes and how often specials are taught and in what structure.
Alex?
Thank you. This is really fascinating, and I'm really sorry I can't be there in person for professional reasons. I have three questions for you, and maybe some of them come up later. Number 1, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the actual impact on job 1, like the performance and the improving performance, because you mentioned the smaller ones actually aren't doing a bad job at improving performance. It's about this other stuff. Secondly, I'm curious if the number of schools with the amount of instruction that we have leads to like more money going into like facilities maintenance than goes into instruction. So if we're having an increasing, like the ratio of seats to kids keeps going up, are we spending less on instruction because we're spending proportionally more on maintenance and facilities and operations? And then the third part, just to be clear, like these school function things that we're talking about in elementary do not affect our middle and high schools because they have a big enough scale, even if it's smaller, that we're not cutting into this kind of efficiency. So sorry to put 3 questions, but those are the ones I'm thinking about.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks for making time for us today and calling in, and really appreciate you being here with us virtually. Impact on performance, I think, is if we were to look at how our schools are performing today, as measured by the school performance framework, the 2 round school and then the 1 round schools that we have, they're achieving at the highest rates they ever have. Flatirons Elementary, which is our smallest outside of the mountain schools, has just had the best year it's ever had. So I think that from, and Robin alluded to this, when you have high expectations, adopt high quality instructional materials, have the right systems and structures and supports, and have really good teachers, on things like the school performance framework, we're doing better, much better. But it's not about today, it's about tomorrow. If we had all 1 round schools, how would that impact? It would be tough to say. If we all had all 1 and 2 round schools, I mean, at some point the systems, the resources start breaking down, and then you have choices to make, right? Is it that you have 3 electives? Maybe you have 2 electives. Maybe you pick an elective. You know, maybe you have somebody who teaches all the electives and maybe doesn't have the expertise in art or music or physical education. And then you just have generalists or specialists doing those types of things. And so I think it's hard to say, and I don't know that there's any research out there around school size and student performance. That would be something that I would turn to as a standard within K-12 education. The dollars for facilities, if you spend more on facilities and maintenance and less on instruction, the more facilities you have, that's half of the equation. The other half is how many students that you have. And we're going to get to this part, because we're going to talk about benefits and risks, right? If you make a bunch of big, bold moves to fix one problem, and then we end up with a couple hundred less students, right? Then, looking at the expense and then looking at the dollars that you generate by students that you serve, I mean, you have to balance that equation and think about both of those things when you're looking at that. So, I mean, theoretically, Alex, the more seats you have, the more money you're spending, right? So, that I would say, and the bigger your school, the more efficient it is. Now, board members and the public knows this at this point. I've worked in really big, large, fast-growing, like suburban urban districts in big cities, Atlanta and Orlando. And it would be common for an elementary school to have 1,400 kids. Super efficient, bad for kids. Right? There's a balance, right? It's not, efficiency isn't, you can get super efficient and kids get lost and not be able to keep up with what's going on because the ratios of administrator to teacher to family it just becomes like a black hole. And it's just, you're trying to keep kids safe, keep the lights on and cover curriculum. So super efficient schools, big, large. I mean, I worked at a high school with 4,200 kids. Efficient. It had one principal, right? So the principal cost goes down, right? You had an army of administrators trying to keep up with the kids, and kids lost, and who knows if they don't. It was just there's a sweet spot, I think, that you have to try to strive for, and each community has a different sweet spot. There's some communities who value efficiency, and other communities that are really like our community, as we value the student experience. I would believe in my 7.5 years of working here that is the value of this community, is getting a great experience where all kids belong and they're challenged academically and they can be successful. So I do think that, at its face, yes, more seats cost more money, but also that there's another side to that equation. And then finally, middle school, high school impact, it just depends upon, schools have to make choices. I'll quote our friend Bill Sutter. At a high school, you can do anything, but you can't do everything. Right? You can't have all the electives you used to have, add new electives, add career technical education, add more college level opportunities, add more work-based experiences without reducing other opportunities for kids, because you only have so many teachers and so many kids, and you got to fill the schedule up. And if you create schedules, and we're seeing this happening in high schools now, where high schools hanging on to like tried and true historical, we've had this elective for 20 some years, but it only has 10, 15 kids in it. For every class you have 10, 15 kids in, you go over class size in another, right? And if you have one section of something, it's hard to schedule kids in. I might be getting in the weeds a little bit, but you're starting to see some of that impact a little bit at high schools. Now, again, if we filled our high schools up, I was here when Boulder High was at 100%, right? Folks weren't really 103%. If we were to operate all of our schools at 100%, you would get a feeling that they're all overcrowded. So, I mean, I just think that those are, yes, there's impact. Yes, there's choices to be made. Yes, there's things that we can think about and discuss. And I would say there's benefits and risks to any decision you make, including not doing anything.
I just want to kind of go back a little bit to the impact on students as we think about the 3-round, 2-round discussion, because you mentioned, right, you lose a counselor, special eds, special education teachers. I think we're doing really well, right? But we still have these big gaps in terms of, outcomes for different kids. And so to the degree that this affects our ability to serve those kids who are multilingual learners, who are in special education, gifted and talented programs, free and reduced lunch, and that's the programming that you lose, right? As we get in size, as our sizes go down. So I just want to raise that point again. And then how does this impact planning for teacher FTEs every year? How does it impact flexibility in class size and that sort of stuff as we shrink?
Class size, I think, is something we should spend a little bit of time talking about. And Robin alluded to this. The least efficient is when you have enough kids for 2 maxed out classes, right? And not enough for 3. And the more rounds you have, the easier it is to absorb students, right? It's easier to have, if you have 3 rounds of 22 kids, right? If 10 kids move in, 15 kids move in, like you're going to be all right, right? If you have 1 round at 28 and 5 kids move in, right? So are you going to have 2 rounds of like 15? Because remember, it's just every round that you have is 15, right? Where are you making up for it on the other end? Either you're allocating additional dollars or you're making other classes larger as a system. Like it's impossible to look at it as the single individualized school. You have to look at this systemically. So theoretically, if the kids showed up in the right quantities, bigger schools have the ability to absorb more kids and keep class sizes. You have more places for kids to go. Like class sizes don't go up exponentially. Like if, after Labor Day or if somebody should that this happens, right? And board members, we hear this, right? You have, and it creates just different challenges in schools because one year I have 19 kids in my class because we couldn't have 38 kids in one class. The next year I have 29. Which is within the range that we've set with our negotiated agreement and how we allocate FTE. But then it feels like, wait a minute, why is my class size so big? Whereas when your class size is really small, people don't say, why is my class size so small, right? So the logistics around elementary school class size. Now, middle school, high school, again, it's what you offer, how many sections. How many kids in middle school do you have per grade, right? The fewer kids you have, the range of error on how things can go, they can get really big and really small. The more sections you have teachers that have them, teaching the same thing, the more easily you can absorb, right? So I would say that it's not a guarantee that the bigger school you have, you're going to have smaller class sizes. I want to be really clear with that, right? But the number of really small and really high class sizes gets solved because you have just more teachers to be able to absorb in a school.
I really appreciate today's conversation. I think my colleagues have brought up all the points I wanted to bring up as well. So I don't even have any of the hard work to do, but I'm going to summarize a little bit. I liked that Lanier brought up the impact on staff. I think that's a real thing. And Robin added the climate and culture impact, the lack of the opportunity for staff to collaborate. And we know how incredibly important it is for our teachers to collaborate as we're rolling out new curricular initiatives. I think that can't get lost in the conversation. I liked that Jason and Jorge brought up the impact on students and what will happen to the loss of specials. And that we're seeing that in my own daughter's school, right? We've got, I think, 3 PE teachers this year, and each of the kids has they all have different PE teachers. Is that the worst thing ever? Of course not, but it's an impact. It's an impact on the culture and climate, impact on consistency, et cetera. Anyway, I just wanted to say I appreciate this conversation. I think everyone's asking the exact right questions. And this is why we've been saying for 4 years that this is probably the most important pressing issue that this board or any board moving forward is going to be dealing with, our response to declining enrollment. We can't solve birth rates and we can't solve the cost of living, but I'm really keep up the good work, guys.
Alex, I heard you beat, but is your question about this section or the next section? You're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, so I also want to, I appreciate Beth's summary, and I wanted to capture one other point that was touched on briefly that I think is pretty key to the long-term discussion, and that's that this is for all our elementary schools, not just the ones that are being identified by our long-range process. And so while we have a system that's set up to deal with those that are most severely declining, the impacts and the dynamics we're talking about affect all our elementary schools. And so that's why I think of this as a district-wide issue, a neighborhood by neighborhood issue with multiple schools being affected, and the parents and the families and the teachers in elementary schools that are not on the lists for intervention are suffering the negative effects and the dynamics now. So that's why I think it's important as a board and staff to be thinking about it from all the schools. And that's where I'm excited to have the chance to start having deeper conversations about the whole, all our kids in, pre-K through 5.
Kitty?
I'm not suggesting we do this, but I'm wondering what it would take for all of our schools, elementaries, to be 3 rounds. I think it'd be good for the community to understand what would have to happen.
So that's in our section on data. I think there's some graphs and some charts that illustrate how many students are missing. And if we remember that 450 students per 3-round school, that'll come up in the data. Can you hold that question until then?
I can answer it in 2 seconds. More kids, less schools. But
Given
less
that we-
schools with all the kids staying. Like if you have less schools and you have less kids, more kids, less schools.
Yeah, I was just trying to get at like, how many schools would we have to close for that to work? Just ballpark.
We'll get to that, and because we can't answer that, because the second you start talking about those types of things, school closures, so on and so forth, in a place and in a state with so much choice, it would be impossible for me to even predict how the system would react, which is why, and just for our community, just to be incredibly, incredibly clear, if we did not have the school choice laws that we have in Colorado that started in 1991, the way that you solve this problem is you redistrict schools and you close schools. And you do that either proactively or reactively, but that's what you do. And it always tears communities apart. It never goes easily, but that is the move. Now, when you have a system like we have with choice, where 1/3 of our parents don't even go to their homeschool today, and that can change and adjust in any way, shape, or form, depending upon the ecosystem that we build, which is our system of schools. It becomes really, really, really hard to even begin to model out and predict what might happen in that scenario. So, but it's important, because I know board members, you hear this, I hear this as well, right? The person who, the casual observer who hasn't paid attention to 4 years of long-range advisory committee meetings and, umpteenth number of board members and board policies would just say, well, you just need to close schools, right? And the sooner you do it, and the faster we'll be able to move on. It is more complicated than that.
Feels a little weird to chime into a conversation after my colleagues have summed it up. But I just, as a parent who started, their student started in elementary school at a 4-round elementary school and watched it shift to a 3-round elementary school and was involved in that panic. It's why a decade ago I started looking at the enrollment matrices, because there are changes in culture and community and funding and staffing and all of the things. I have a high degree of empathy for those that are experiencing what opportunities are now available at our schools as they continue to get small. It is hard to live through that change and understand what was a norm and what can no longer be a norm unless we change course. And I think that's, board members, the biggest thing we hear about is the programmatic opportunities in our schools as we go to go through these decreasing rounds. And so I'm glad we spent a good amount of time on the first 8 slides, and we've got a lot to go through. So let's just transition over into the data.
So I'm going to, Glenn Segru, senior planner at the district. I'm going to go through elementary level with a focus on the regions in the district and try to focus in on the different regions where they're at and also the individual schools in those regions. So just moving on quickly, this is an overall chart for the district, both enrollment the last few years or actually the trends from the last few years going into our projected enrollment going forward. So we're expecting to see continued K-12 declines at around between 1.5 or 1 to 1.5% out into the future. We see the red line on 2025. That's where we came in with our preliminary October numbers. So we came in a little bit low this year. And we'll be looking into those reasons going forward, but it did come in a little low, lower than expected. But otherwise, we don't at this point see any reasons that these trends won't generally hold going into the future until we look at that a little more closely. And then you look at the dark area on the bottom, that's the elementary. So we can see those continued declines that we're expecting as well. In this chart, we have a pie chart showing total capacity, and it probably should clarify what capacity is and maybe isn't in the district. Capacity is typically classrooms 600 square feet or bigger, and you count those classrooms that are available for instruction, and you apply the average teacher ratio to those. So for elementary, it doesn't include areas that serve kids that are already in the building, such as gyms or art rooms, because those aren't new classes. It's just the ones that hold a regularly scheduled classroom. Secondary operates a little differently, but fundamentally still you're counting up those classrooms and loading a staffing ratio to it. When you're below capacity, you don't necessarily have empty space. Schools have a way of spreading out and maybe adding some supplemental programming through their own ways of doing things, some extra music or something. But it isn't really until you start getting closer to about 50%, you really start seeing actual empty classrooms in the building. And to go back, currently what we're looking at in BVSD overall at elementary, we have about 9,900 K-5 non-charter kids that we serve with a capacity of 14,000, almost 600 students. That leaves us at just about 65% capacity going forward in 28, 29, and in excess. So that means we have excess capacity of around 35% at that time.
And just to clarify, Glenn, that's with all schools at 100% capacity.
Yes, yes. And to look at it regionally, you see Boulder, Louisville, Superior, Lafayette, Erie, Broomfield along the side, the schools that we're considering part of those regions, and a comparison of the utilization. That's the percent of that capacity that's being filled at this, here in 24, and you see 65% for Boulder, and also at 59% by the time we get to 2029, according to current projections. If we move down to Louisville Superior, very similar numbers, slightly higher, 67% now utilization, 61% projected out into 2029, and Lafayette, Erie, a different story, actually projected to grow a little bit in the next 5 years with some of the new development along that line. So they're not really struggling with capacity the way other parts of our district are in terms of filling the schools at least. And lastly, Broomfield, not as low as Boulder and Louisville, but some of the schools there are seeing some lower enrollment and bringing their overall enrollment down 74 to 73. And of course, Broomfield is very, very different than the other parts of the district because they take in very large numbers of out-of-district kids. So the enrollment versus the resident students is a very big difference. And seeing what that looks like going forward with enrollment trends coming from the past, from 2019 to present, and then projected out in the lighter gray areas going forward. Again, we put in the little red line on there where their preliminary numbers have come in for 25, 26. And we see, of course, Boulder continued declines going forward. Same with Louisville, Superior, Lafayette, Erie, same story. Actually, maybe building a little bit and growing somewhat going it forward. And Broomfield's just really been on this long, slow slide for a long time, and they're really continuing that slide going forward as well. And I think we've seen this slide before showing the LRAC matrix, standards metrics that we developed in previous years with enrollment advisory status for schools, meaning schools that are at or below 2 rounds or 60% of capacity, and the engagement phase triggering at 1.5% or 1.5 rounds and 50% capacity. So looking at school year 2024, which is our most current complete data year that we have, these are the schools we're looking at who are now in either advisory or engagement, with Heatherwood being the only school that we are actually considered to be in engagement currently. Going for projected 2025, we'll see a few schools that will come on and off the list. Some are leveling off, and they'll kind of toggle right between those categories. But continuing forward to 2029, where we could potentially have 8 schools in that advisory status and 3 schools in engagement. And really 2 in Boulder and 1 in Broomfield, according to our last projections. So focusing in on just the Boulder region. So these are the schools we would be considering Boulder. I think we have left out Johnstown and Gold Hill on some of these lines, but they do actually feed into Boulder middle and high schools. Boulder, the current capacity of 7,100 seats with a resident students of 4,100 and enrollment of 4,600. So about 500 students coming into that area from other parts of the district or out of district. That brings our current utilization at about 65%. And this is a breakout of a previous chart we've shown before. The shaded areas show where advisory status is triggered from the LRAC criteria. The darker red areas are the engagement criteria that are a part of that. And you need 2 of the same color to actually hit that status. So this is a graphic or a table representation of the map that we showed earlier, just for Boulder. And we can see as we go along, by 2029, Boulder could have 6 schools in advisory and possibly 2 in engagement, according to projections. And I think that to kind of piggyback a little bit off of Dr. Anderson's comments about the complexity of enrollment and open enrollment, this is taken from our data dashboard for enrollment, and it does a good job of breaking out what's in the enrollment matrices and what the school compositions look like. On that dashboard, we only have it broken out by North and South Boulder, so that's how we have it represented here. But we can see, can't quite see those numbers that far out, but we can see on the right side or left side of North Boulder, that would be the resident population for those schools. And overall, we're seeing about 58% of those resident students attend their own school. And we compare that to South Boulder, it's a little bit higher at 64% of those students that are attending the school that is their neighborhood school. On the other hand, when we look at the enrollment composition, North Boulder, about 64% of enrollment in North Boulder is composed of neighborhood students, while in South Boulder, you're only seeing 44%. So you do see a lot of movement from North Boulder to South Boulder, where a lot of our choice schools are in Boulder, filling those spaces. So you see some of those discrepancies there, but we are seeing, on average around that 65% of students attending their neighborhood school. And we can also see in the bottom portion, those trends have generally held over the years. Now this chart focusing in even more on just the attendance area composition by each individual school.
Glenn, can you go back to this last slide? I just want to make a point. Because these trends year over year since 2018 stay the same, then that allows us to try to make better predictions because the ecosystem has stayed the same. Everybody understand that? So, whether it's, whatever the percentages are, as long as there's like a small range of error on what we think is going to happen, it does allow Glenn to be able to make some predictions. It does allow Robin and her team to make some staffing decisions in ways where we're able to try to create stable, when we hire teachers, we're not shuffling them around at the beginning of the school year, right? They get to stay. This past year, we were a little bit more cautious in adding additional teachers because we feel like that's an adjustment to the system that helps us to, if there's some unpredictable variability. But I will say that when you look at these regional enrollment profiles, when you do make changes, shifts in the ecosystem, right, it'll be harder to understand what's happening because our trends will change because the conditions have changed.
So again, this is based on attendance area composition, the number of students that live in the attendance area by school. The dark blue area are the resident students that are live in that attendance area and go to that school. The green portion of the line are the students that are leaving that school for another focus charter or another neighborhood school through open enrollment. And then the total line are all of the kids that live in that area. So when we look at this for Boulder, takeaways are resident students cannot support 2 rounds at Flatirons, Douglas, and Mesa. And I did forget the red line there is the level for 2 rounds, which is approximately 300 students. We see Heatherwood and Whittier are at 2 rounds when we just consider their neighborhood population. So if all kids went to the school, we didn't have open enrollment, that would be the situation for that school. Creekside, Columbine, and Crestview, their resident attending rate is near or below 50%. So while some of these schools are bigger and can support, their neighborhood populations could support very large schools, we also see some of our bigger schools are where we see the most kids leaving for other schools. And this is a similar chart, but is now the enrollment for each school and looking at the composition of the students that are actually sitting in the seats at that school. The little triangle or diamond area in red is the projection that we had for 2029. And when we look at it this way, we can see 10 schools are expected to continue to decline over the next 5 years. 6 schools currently are enrolled above 2 rounds, but only 3 schools are expected to be above 2 rounds by 2019 or 2029, sorry.
Board members, we're going to pause here before we go into the next section. And so questions about overall district-wide trends and then Boulder specific. And we're going to go around the dais backwards this time. So we're going to start with Beth, Jorge, and then Alex.
Formulating a question. I think I want to go back to slide, what was it? Slide number 12, where for me, what's striking about that slide is, you have, and you see that the schools in green, our focus schools, are obviously largely clustered in Boulder area. And I guess, I don't know what my question is. I am wondering what do we make of this? What do we think would happen if we were to move focus schools to another part of the district? Would that be something that would be, how would that change?
We're in the dangerous space of speculation. Just be very, very clear. I think that, and I'd have to take a deeper dive. So I'm just going to, my intuition tells me that that where they're located also impacts their enrollment. So it's not as if, but you could think about this, think about a store or think about a restaurant, right? Location matters, right? So, but if it's a really great restaurant, maybe you drive across town for it. But, if you look at the ratios of kids in Boulder, right, who go to a different school but stay in Boulder, that might lead you to know and understand that that there is some impact on their location and their programming. I do think that when we get to the end and I talk about, like, there's like a limited number of things you can do, and it's the combination of things that you put together that create the plan. You could move focus schools, right? And what might happen? Maybe you move some of the, you move the problems into another neighborhood, right? You could, if you move the focus schools next to another school, and a lot of folks want to go to that school that were going to their neighborhood school, you change the dynamic. Again, but we'd be going into this blind because we hadn't talked to anybody, right? And that's another thing that we'll talk about moving forward. But these are the types of things that we have to think about. And so I just want to be, really clear as whether the media or our folks who are writing about this. We've had some recently some folks in the community have started writing about this. There was an article in the Boulder Reporting Lab, which I appreciate people paying attention, but there's also a reason we don't do 10-year projections. We can get into that a little bit. There's some things that you miss, and there's a range of error in anything that you project, and some of that maybe wasn't included in the article, maybe for whatever reason. So, we're just thinking about potential impacts, not saying that we're doing any of these things or this is what would happen if you did those things. I'm just trying to be very clear around that.
And before Jorge, I just want to put in a plug. Our dashboard is incredibly helpful because you can look school by school and you can see that for Uni Hill and High Peaks, a lot of North Boulder kids are going to those schools. Community Montessori, a lot of kids from out east are going to those schools. You can see where they're already drawing from. And so I appreciate the district's foresight, this board's foresight, LRAC, to get those dashboards up to give us a look as we think about what decisions we can make, have an understanding of where are kids coming from and how far are they currently willing to travel.
And no district I know of, we are leading the country in transparency around this. I just don't know of another district that has gone to the lengths that we have had over the past 4 years to not just be proactive, but to be transparent.
Jorge and then Alex.
These slides are kind of, we've seen them before, but they're striking in this conversation because the forecast says, 2 schools will be above a 2-round in 5 years. That's not different from where we are right now. Right? There's 3 schools that are above 2 rounds right now. The problem is here, right? And we don't have the number of students to address that. But looking at slide 19, where Columbine and Crestview have a large number of students that are going elsewhere and have the capacity. Looking at Boulder, I have a hard time looking at these schools and where they're located. They seem packed pretty tight. I don't know to what degree the maps are to scale. But, how close are some of these schools in that area? I can't tell based on the map, looking like geographically close. Proximity for all these different schools, especially when you see such a contrast between like Columbine, Crestview, the number of student population, and Flatirons, Foothill, Heatherwood. Some are far apart, but some are really clustered tightly together. So I'm not sure that's a question.
Just real quick, this is to scale, and
Okay.
the schools are accurately located actually on the building. So I don't know offhand, but that I could find that out, but
I looked yesterday at this
'Cause-
exact, I was actually Google mapping this. And so if you can see where Flatirons and Uni Hill is, it's less than a mile. And same thing, those two are less than a mile apart. Yep. And then like, there's a lot of schools that are a mile between each other.
Yeah, that's the impression I had, but I knew it wasn't quite accurate, but.
Alex, you're up.
Thank you. Yeah, I just had sort of a question, sort of an observation. If I look at slide 12 again, it looks to me like Louisville and Superior look like everything blue and nothing's green. And then if I look at the slide where you have, or the same slide, you'll see that the projected enrollment is actually, also going down 6%, just like Boulder is. And that with 1,000 kids, that 6% is like 60 kids, something like that. So they're losing it. They're already below the thresholds, but in our current system, none of them are green. And then you go to Boulder, where yes, we have a pretty much similar decline, and 4 of the green are. So that's where I'm like, okay, I think there are places, there are communities that I draw from that are being affected by the declining enrollment, and that have significant stuff that gets to the impact on the student and teacher experience that are sort of above the thresholds of our current long range approach. And so that's where I'm eager to have these discussions and start thinking about impact on all our kids, all our communities, because I think the sort of threshold-based attention is a disservice to the places just barely above the threshold, but still having problems. And then if I look at slide 19 again, I think I take everyone's point that whatever we did would not matter if people are still choosing to go somewhere else. So we have to do a combination of intelligently designing our schools and placing them and locating them. And we also have to recognize that parents want to go where they want to go. And I do believe when we think about the proportion that's green here for these schools, it's good to note that there's 2 things going on. One is they are choosing some cool place they want to go to. There's an attraction of the thing we have offered. And the other is there's a signal that there's something in that neighborhood school that made the other thing relatively more attractive. So there's something they're dissatisfied with. So as we think about what we do to make our district succeed, I think we need to take into account what we're trying to do at each school, what people are more attracted to go somewhere else, but also what's not attractive to them where they're in their attendance zone and where we might prefer them to go. And so I think that takes some reflection, again, and not just the schools that are the identified ones, but in all our schools, what are we doing that's serving all kids well? And how does that then impact their choices? And then how does that impact our consideration about the long range plan? So that's why I'm excited about our transparency, the depth of our thinking about this. And I want us to be thinking about all our schools and communities as we figure out what's best for the kids. And that's where I'm eager to continue this discussion. So those are my 2 observations I just want to share.
Just real quick, Board Member Medler, on slide 12, just to make sure that we're on the same page. The schools that are highlighted in green on the slide deck, it looks like we have lost the legend. So down below, anything in green is a charter or a focus school.
Okay.
Just
thank you.
Clear.
So how many, I guess I'm curious about how many are on the sort of LRAC list for being identified would be a good thing to know in this as well as the choice stuff. So my mistake. Yeah, so.
No, and I apologize for that.
I'm happy to skip questions and move on. I'm anxious to get to the discussion about kind of next steps. So we've seen this. I'm glad to revisit this. I was going to make a point along Alex's line about just wanting to know a little bit more about why certain schools, why the numbers are so low or lower for certain schools, why people in those attendance zones are not attending their neighborhood school. I don't feel like that's, necessarily the point of today's discussion. So, but I would like to continue that another time, but happy to pass it over to Kitty or Lelania.
So I have two questions and an observation. So the observation is that except for Lafayette and Erie, each region is enrolling more students than there are resident students. And Lafayette and Erie, it's only 5 less. So does that mean that's being made up by out of district students?
You know, it can be complicated because it's a net gain and loss in a lot of situations. So it's, yeah. It can be out of district and it can be in district BVSD as well.
And so 2 questions.
When we started the LRAC process, we made the determination that we were going to do this without looking at the mountain schools, which includes Gold Hill, Jamestown, are on the list so we didn't add Nederland as one of the schools on that list, but I would put Nederland in a similar category in the sense that the challenge in rural communities, mountain communities, is that if you can only close the kids and eliminate the schools and make the kids get on buses and try to drive down and get their services. And so we made a conscious effort, I think, at that point, and I'd let Rob talk about this a little bit, to think about this as our mountain schools. We have different situations up there, right? Where we have schools where we have 1 teacher, we have 2 teachers, right? We have a principal at 2 schools. We've continued to try to find efficiencies there, but the issues, I think, are different than they are down in the rest of our communities. Rob, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, to expand on what you said, I think this has gotten extremely difficult. So the LRAC metrics, as a reminder, don't include mountain schools or charter schools. However, when we're looking at these attendance regions, we need to look at it from an overall capacity standpoint, because we're talking about number of students, how many seats do we have? We consider Gold Hill and Jamestown to be part of Boulder. Nederland is specific to Nederland. So Gold Hill, Jamestown feed into our Boulder schools, where Nederland is a standalone K-12, PK-12 system, if that helps.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Because it looked like we had 2 really small mountain schools on the list, but not the biggest one. My next question is, in these numbers where you're showing resident students that are going to the school versus ones that are open and rolling out, how do the areas with dual enrollment or the choice enrollment, how does that impact how you calculate the figures?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when we brought this before you for the attendance boundaries, we had those split out. Here, we've wrapped in the dual areas into the school. So I basically take the students that are attending one of the 2 schools and count them as towards their neighborhood school. And then the leftovers between the 2, I split in half.
The only dual attendance area is.
Well, I mean, going forward, the only dual is Mesa, but since we're using historic data, this would include the Creekside, Bear Creek area as well.
Right. Thank you. That makes sense. Because you could look at it and think, well, I wonder if everybody in green is just going to the other choice school or dual enrollment area school.
I'd like to stay at a very high level and just highlight something that Jorge brought up, that we have 6 schools now that will be above 3 rounds here out of 16, and then only 3 schools in the future. So the problem is here. It's not some distant ephemeral thing. It's here. And I'd also like to highlight what Alex said, is that schools that are just above the threshold for LRAC metrics that would put them into advisory or whatever section it would put them in, they are still being affected by the overall system. So those 2 things lead me to believe that it's time to do something here, which we can discuss in a bit.
I just want to thank staff, and it gets to Kitty's point a little bit, but the clarity around exactly how many open seats we have in each region. I mean, it is staggering. And looking ahead, the half of our seats in some places will be open as we continue to decline. And I agree that as the system continues to shrink, it does impact everybody. And I also wanted to elevate, it's not probably anybody's goal to get to 100%, but man, 80%, 85%, I've crunched even those numbers, and it's still looking like lots of open seats. So again, this additional level of clarity, I really hope helps the board and helps the public understand where we are today and where we're going to be in 5 years, and that in 2029, there are a lot of schools that don't even meet 2 rounds. And so if we want to maintain our programmatic excellence, something has to change.
So moving on to Louisville Superior area. These are the map of the school and attendance areas involved in that area. Current capacity of 3,000 students with a resident population closer to 2,000 and an enrollment a little above that as well, and a utilization rate of about 67%. And projected 2029 utilization of 61%. And one of the things about Louisville Superior area is we have a lot of movement. They're kind of midway through the district. So we have students in Louisville Superior opening to Boulder schools. So we saw Boulder schools had 500 more kids than they do that live in that area. That's part of that equation. But then also Louisville schools get backfilled from Lafayette and Broomfield area as well. So there's a lot of movement that goes through this region. And we look at that same chart with the LRAC matrix and really seeing in terms of low enrollment, according to the matrix, really kind of focused in the first 2 schools, Coal Creek and El Dorado, in the coming years. With a 2029 rounds being averaged about 2.1 across everything, and the number in advisory at 2, and the number of in engagement at 0. And that same enrollment chart that we saw before, but somewhat different than Boulder. In the resident attendance area on the left, we're seeing 75% of the kids that live in Louisville attend their own neighborhood school, which is quite a bit higher than Boulder. And conversely, their enrollment in the seats too is also around 75%. And those trends also have held over time. And looking at it from the attendance area populations, again, the dark blue being the resident students and the green, those that open and roll out. We see Coal Creek, Louisville Elementary, and Superior above 2 rounds with their neighborhood populations. Fireside right at about 2 rounds, and Monarch and El Dorado with their resident populations at 2 rounds. And we also see Monarch also tends to have a little bit lower resident attending rate than the other schools in the area. And from the enrollment side, we can see Fireside, Louisville Elementary, and Superior are well above 2 rounds in enrollment currently. Coal Creek, El Dorado, and Monarch are under 2 rounds. We can see Monarch resident attending population is low, and Monarch actually is on a pretty high open enrollment into that school, which they do get. But we do see enrollment declines expected over the next 5 years in 4 of those 5 schools. And moving on to Lafayette Erie, these are the schools we have less concerns about. Utilization 86%, and actually expected to go up in current years or in future years. according to the LRAC matrices, they don't really register much. Enrollment profile actually a little bit lower, towards half of the students that actually attend schools in those regions. A big chunk of that we can see is rolling out to charters, and a little bit more enrolling out of the district as well, although that doesn't really show up here. And with resident populations well above that 2-round marker that we've been seeing. And same with enrollment composition over time, pretty healthy, most schools, pretty well above 2 rounds, Sanchez being close to it, but Sanchez does have a large attendance area with quite a few students in it. So they do have a pool to draw from compared to other parts of the district where their enrollment might be below 2 rounds, but they don't have that resource. Oops. And lastly, Broomfield. These are the schools we're talking about, 1,700, almost 1,800 total capacity, resident population now of 1,100, but with enrollment at 1,320. Again, that difference from out of district primarily, and some little bit from other parts of the district coming into the area. Utilization rate of about 75%, and projected to tick down slightly over the next 5 years. And according to the LRAC matrix here, we have Aspen Creek and Emerald seem to hold well above over time, and really Birch and Cole are the ones that the LRAC matrix we start to look at a little bit more closely. So in the end, in 2029, we're seeing possibly 1 in advisory and 1 in engagement. At that time. In looking at the open enrollment profile, about 73% of the students attend their neighborhood school, which is pretty strong compared to other parts of the district. But when we look at composition of the seats on the right, we see 65% of enrollment is from neighborhood students. So again, it's that huge out of district component that skews their enrollment in the long run. And looking at attendance area composition, 2 of the 4 schools that we're looking at are below 2 rounds based on attendance area population. Aspen Creek and Emerald students are only slightly over the 2 rounds. And more telling, I think when we look at the enrollment, we see the out-of-district enrollment really plays a big part in keeping these schools that are above 2 rounds, but also contributing to the 2 schools, Birch and Cole, that are below 2 rounds. So the summary takeaways, I think by region, Boulder enrolls, continues to decline. 10 of the 14 schools, or 71%, are projected to be at or below 2 rounds in 2029. In Louisville Superior, we're seeing continued enrollment declines as well. 3 of 6 schools are projected to be at or below 2 rounds in 2029. Lafayette Erie, we see slow enrollment growth actually, with no schools projected to be significantly below 2 rounds out into the future. And Broomfield also continuing some declines with 2 of their 4 schools projected to be at or below 2 rounds. So that's it for the elementary. I don't know if we want to keep going.
Let's pause there before we get into the middle school data. Board members, questions, closing thoughts. Kitty, I'll start with you.
So I have a question about schools in the engagement phase, because we have Heatherwood, which has been through it and has come up with a plan. How long do we keep schools, or I shouldn't say that, how long would we go with the school in an engagement stage even after they have come up with a plan? Yeah, I'm not sure how that works. I mean, is the community decided we can stay at this even though, I mean, at this low enrollment, even after implementing a plan? Or do we re-engage?
Well, not every, we've had one school in engagement. After engaging them, we created the eSTEAM program. But adding a program when you don't have enough kids to go around is not like, it won't be you go into engagement and then you get to add a program and see what happens, right? Like there's just not enough kids to go around. So I would say that I don't know that we have a hard and fast rule around what happens. I think that that's why we're having this conversation, where when you look at this summary, the summary slide, if we can go back, that you have, and Alex alluded to this, and Elenia and others, you have widespread enrollment issues, even if some of those schools today are where they need to be, like the sustainability for all schools in the entire community is getting to a place where we have some choices and decisions to make. So we don't have a hard and fast rule on engagement. I think Heather would. We were treating each of these as an individual situation to see what happened and made the most sense. For just as a reminder to the public and the board, for 2 years in a row, we slowed declining enrollment in half. We didn't do that this year. We had projected 2% 2 years ago. We went to 1%. We had projected 1%. We went to 0.5%. We are down based on we're down. So, the situation and the environment is shifting underneath our feet. So, all that to say, I think that's why we're having a conversation today.
What's interesting about this summary slide, and we've been using 2 rounds because that was part of the LRAC metrics on all of the slides, looking at enrollment and where they are. By 2029, only 2 schools will be at 3 rounds. So we started this conversation talking about programmatic and operational efficiencies and the pros and cons between a 3-round and a 2-round school. So in 2029, 2 schools will be at 3 rounds. Everybody else will be at 2 or below. And if you look at the city of Boulder, 71% will be, it's significant. So I think to Kitty's point, how long do the LRAC recommendations carry us through? I think you hear from community that are in some of these phases and it feels like purgatory. Feels like they're stuck. They don't know how to get it. There's no way out. And so I think that's just something for us to consider moving forward as projections continue to drop system-wide. What is the desire of that school community? How do they want to move forward? How do we engage them in moving forward? And then, as a systems level, a board that has to make decisions for the whole system, how can we work to improve the situations for folks at those schools so they don't just feel like they're forever waiting? Board members, any other thoughts on the enrollment data for Lafayette, Louisville, Broomfield before we move on to middle school? Kitty.
So I just had one more thought about the process that LRAC gave us, because we talk about the once they're in engagement, there's a group convened among the community and they look at a number of options and come up with either we stay the same and we have less to offer, or we do something like a special program to boost enrollment, or we close. And I'm just wondering if when we get to that point, unless we change the process, which we might do based on what we're seeing in enrollment, is if you get a community group together and they decide they don't want to close, it's possible that we would close them anyway or not. I'm just thinking of how we would deal with that.
So at the end of the presentation, we will talk about all of the things you can do. And I will say, board members, that these are conversations that LRAC has had. This idea that, this is the conversation you're having, LRAC has been having as well. I think that and I'll let Rob speak to that, but this idea of you have to broaden the scope of what you're looking at to be able to solve some of these problems, and how you do that and how you're thoughtful and how you're engaging, and how you're setting what success looks like, I think is part of the process. But Rob, if you want to talk a little bit about those conversations that have been going on, I know with LRAC.
First of all, to address Kitty's question, there's some very promising results from Heatherwood and what we've learned from there. They've retained more resident students than they have in a long time. And I think that is due to the fact that we engaged their community. It was a very thoughtful, we didn't go in with a plan. We listened, we developed. And what we got out of that is something that the community in Heatherwood desired. We can't do that everywhere. And this is what we've struggled with in LRAC is Heatherwood is in a very unique geographic area, to where we don't have a school within a mile like other schools have. So when we look at this from other regions, it's got to be more of a regional approach versus a school by school approach. So that is the mindset going in. That's what we've kind of struggled with up to this point. But the metrics were in place. Just, it's a backstop. It's just to make sure that people are aware of where we're at in the process, right? So it's an early warning system is how I would refer to it, how the other members on LRAC have referred to it. Jeff or Yvette, anything you would add to that on discussions at LRAC?
So thanks, Rob. I think we agree with that. In several previous presentations to the board, LRAC has used the words holistic as the need for solutions. And so what we have done so far and what the board has done off those recommendations so far, this idea of early warning system is correct. And so those schools that are having these situations have been warned, they've been engaged. I don't think that the board has promised them what the solutions will be. And so I think you need to be creative in what those solutions are. And as far as the purgatory thing, I think you're going to have a chance later here to talk about timescales. Again, I've talked to folks and people want to find solutions. So I don't think we should just say, well, we passed this thing and now we're just going to sit there for the next 5 years and see what happens.
The only thing I would add to that is that we were very clear that we wanted to be transparent, not just to the board, but to the families and the community that those schools that are affected by.
Alex, I think you chimed with a question.
I just wanted to say, well, first off, I wanted to say that I really appreciate, and I don't want anybody to think that our conversation today is any criticism of the LRAC and all the work and the engagement that's been done over the period of time they're doing. And I think they've done a great job at the task they were given and achieved, sort of the functional purpose to move us along. And so I just want to make sure that no one thinks, oh, the board's going to take a different direction from the LRAC. It's like, no. We've learned a lot from the LRAC, and they have advanced our community level district-wide discussion in a fantastic job. And so this is thanks for the input. Now what do we do as we think about this? And I will say one of the other big pictures things for me is, and maybe this is something to think about more over time, but I think ultimately we're a district, so we have our 27,000 odd kids that we're dealing with. But we also have families who don't choose to be enrolled in our schools that live in our district. And we do talk about how we recruit the families into our district, but I think in the big picture, something that we want to keep in mind is we want to keep more families from open enrolling out of the district, and we want to keep more families from feeling like they have to go to private schooling or homeschooling to choose that for their kids. And so that's part of the reasons why I'm interested in those kids who are families who are not enrolling their kid in their neighborhood school and who are not enrolling their kid in any BVS school. Because I think of those families as folks that we could do that would actually increase the number total and not just be about how to efficiently distribute what we have left. So that's where I think at some level, it's great to see the impact on our in-district or people entering into the district through open enrollment. And that's why I also want to understand all those green families in those graphs and understand what we could do, not just to keep them in their neighborhood school, but to keep them in the district period. And I think that's something else to add to sort of our long range planning and say, what's the effort to get more in? And I will say, I think there's two external shocks to this that could make it more problematic. And number one is like the role of homeschooling in not just our community, but nationwide. And the advent of like AI helping families at homeschool feel more capable to do so. So I think we have a lot of homeschooling we don't understand in the district that we could serve, but that we risk losing families to it. And I think we have, potential more forms of choice, depending on what Governor Polis does, that we need to consider. So anyway, I don't want to complicate all this by that, but I think one of the things undergirding all this is an understanding that the total pie we have can shrink or grow. And that some of the things we do shrink or grow the pie that we're distributing.
I want to chime in about LRAC, piggybacking on Alex's comment. I would agree. No, I think the board is really supportive and appreciative of all the work that LRAC has been doing. But if we think about how we look at data in 5 years, we don't project 10 years out, we project 5 years out. Next year will be year 5. I mean, be the 5th year of LRAC. And so conditions have just changed. In the past 4 years, we've become increasingly transparent thanks to the work of the committee. Our public has an understanding of where we are. And now, as we approach the 5th year, 4th and 5th years of looking at declining enrollment, it's a great time to reconsider how we continue to move forward. With that, we can transition to the topic of middle schools and Dr. Anderson. Oh, sure. We've all just been taking breaks at our leisure, but we can take a 5-minute comfort break. Welcome back, everyone. We will now transition into the middle school enrollment data portion of today. And I know that LRAC is eagerly awaiting some board direction on this. So be thinking about what kind of direction we might want to give their committee when it comes to enrollment.
Middle school enrollment. I think what we're really looking at with this is what LRAC is going to be looking at in this coming year and focusing on. So we wanted to give some high level information on middle just to kind of cue that discussion that's coming. So when we look at the trends at the middle level, at the same regions that we looked at elementary level, we still see middle school. So far, it's kind of been up and down and more level in the past, but we're expecting that to start going down as those, we continue to get smaller and smaller cohorts from elementary. So we see the projection continuing down in Boulder, with that red line indicating where actually the preliminary enrollment came in for this October. Similarly with Louisville, a continued slide downward out the next 5 years. Growth in Lafayette, Erie, as would be expected. And Broomfield still on that, similar to elementary, that just really slow slide that they've been on for a long time. And this is what it looks like at the individual school level, at the middle school level, with anticipated capacities, also utilizations. We've used that terminology elsewhere in this slideshow. But overall, we're seeing declines with our non-charter schools of around 500 over the next 5 years. And similarly, this is with the capacity chart looking at currently, we have about 8,000, 8,100 6-8 students in our charter schools, or non-charter schools rather. We serve 5,500 in school year 24-25 in the non-charter schools, and that puts our utilization rate at middle level around 68%, which means about 2,600 open seats at the middle level. And that's expected to go up to about 3,000 open seats by in the 5-year projection. So we can see the pie chart on the right is for our 5-year projection, and we can see enrolled at about 63% in the capacity and about 37% of open capacity.
jump in here real quick on this. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, LRAC has would like to see us put metrics in place, something that staff has really struggled with. As you can see, the timeline for middle level metrics we've been talking about since last year. We're continuing to talk about it this year. Be careful with the capacity at the middle level. Some of these middle levels were not built for middle schools in particular. And when we look at the elementary, when we put those metrics together, it was really around the student experience. So we talked about 2 classes per grade level. Middle level systems and structures are a lot more flexible than our elementary systems and structures. So we're not constrained at the same level like we are at the elementary schools. So again, any guidance the board wants to provide, LRAC, we would be open to that. Something we continue to discuss, and something we bring back to the board at a later date when we land on it.
I've been thinking about middle school metrics and candidly struggling because the conditions that are K-8s are very different than in a standard middle school. Like geography comes into play. Some of our schools are designed small. Some of our schools are designed really large. I don't know if there's an easy, it doesn't strike me as something as easy to create metrics around like an elementary school would. And I think the levers that you could pull are entirely different with the few number of middle schools we have in each spread out across the district. The thing I think the most about is experience and access to opportunity. So if schools get so small that they can no longer offer a full complement of elective courses or advanced courses in the same topic, like once the educational experience starts to shift in a way, the programmatic experience starts to shift, for me, that's a red flag, but I don't know. It's just very different. I mean, Meadowlark, it's a tiny 6 through 8. They have a lot of kids in it. Our 6 to 8 and our other K-8s, some of them are at good capacity, some are at less capacity. To your point, Platt used to be a high school, so they have a massive campus. I know Southern Hills right now is the biggest it's been in a long time, and I continue to hear complaints about how full school feels, even though they're only at 78% because the hallways are narrow and there's lots of weird stairs. And so the schools all feel really different. And I think their capacity to house students. And then I think about the complaints I'm hearing from certain middle schools that are also bigger than they've ever been, and they're having more behavioral problems. And so I think that capacity number is just a little harder at the middle level, given the types of schools we have, where they're located in the district, and the opportunities we would have to make any significant shifts. I mean, there's probably shifts, but it would be very specific to the individual school. So it doesn't help, but part of me, it also maybe there aren't metrics that we can identify for middle schools. This is kind of what I'm coming around to. Other than continue to pay attention to what kinds of academic and co-curricular, extracurricular experiences are we able to offer as class or total enrollment shifts. Dr. Anderson.
Not to make this more complicated, but there are very different philosophical beliefs around middle grades education. And is it a middle school model? Is it more of a junior high model, right? Like, are you focused more on teaming teachers together to really support the social and emotional development of kids as they go from 10 to 14, 15 years old? And how do you sprinkle in opportunities and having that teaming concept? So, and I would say that over time in our district, that philosophy has changed. And so like there's some philosophical, like what is it you're trying to do? Is it the same for everything? Does everybody has their own field? Do you have some standards around curriculum instruction, standards-based instruction, and then some different ability around elective offerings? I know for me, and I know later on this semester, the board has prioritized this idea of acceleration and advancement as an extension to some of the gifted and talented work we've been talking about, and how do you create those accelerated and advanced opportunities for all kids? How does that play into it? So I do agree, Nicole, that it is way more complicated. And then, I mean, Platt, some of the, yeah, it's just complicated.
And the other thing I would say too, our middle schools that are proximate walking distance to high schools, like some of that, the pressure alleviated because they can hop over to a high school and take a class or not. I mean, it just is a very different landscape. Lelania.
I agree with Nicole that I don't think that there's a metric to put here. What I would be interested in getting my colleagues' feedback on when I look at this is while you have to look at each school individually, and I agree that we look at the idea behind each school and are we looking for acceleration? I'm interested in understanding the things that we also do for our district in terms of after-school activities and athletics. And when we have all of this extra capacity, is there a possibility of finding a reasonably central location and having something to support after-school activities district-wide? A sports complex, a marching band complex, whatever it is, because this extra capacity lends itself to that. And I don't have a great solution. And I know it's a big idea that would require bond money. And we would probably have to go back to our generous voters again and ask. But given that we are going to have such a large amount of capacity, I'd like to see how we utilize that space. Going back to Alex's comments, always about how school needs to also have the element of what are kids enjoying, what's fun for them, how we support our community at large, and hearkening back to our continual problems of we don't have a place for our kids to be swimming. So I would like my fellow board members to say if they're interested, because certainly I don't want staff to go to work on something that only I'm interested in.
I think if we got to a place where, we could entertain that, I think of our shared athletic facilities for our high schools, right? Is there one shining star theater that our middle schools share? Is there one shining star? I think it's an interesting idea down the road. Sorry, Jeff, and then Beth.
So just quickly on the metric idea, I do want to point out that there are different ways to do metrics than we did for elementary, where we thought one size could fit all. And so on the middle school thing, one possibility is, as an example, staff could define this is the minimum operating student number for what we want to do in this building. And then a metric could be, are we falling below that? And I'm just saying there are ways to still do metrics where we can come to the voters, to the community and say, this is what we're looking at. It's not just something touchy-feely, but it can be much more customized than maybe what just a possibility.
Yeah, and just adding to the conversation, I think we're asking the exact right questions. And I support your idea of opening our minds to what do we do with our capacity, right? And that would go back to the voters. I think the questions that Rob brought up around student experience, I think that's the essential core for all of us on the board, right? And what is that middle school students, whether it becomes middle school, junior high model, regardless, what's that student experience? What programming opportunities are we getting and having to give up as declining enrollment waxes and wanes for our middle schools? So I think there is something to be said about the metrics. I think we're gonna have to keep thinking about this. I think it's difficult. I don't think we have an answer today, but I like the idea of having some sort of metric around opportunity for acceleration. That is something we've heard. I've heard consistently throughout the district. Some schools have it, some schools don't. And, Alex and I are always talking about our differentiation, bandwagon. I also thinking having some sort of metric around after school opportunities and electives is pretty important, because it's my understanding that, as declining enrollment occurs, even in our middle schools, we're losing some of our elective teachers, we're not able to keep them on full time, just like in our elementaries. So those are just some starting thoughts. I know it's tough, but I support thinking about capacity. Like, we've got this space. What can we do with it? What can we do better with it? That makes a lot of sense.
Any other questions on middle level before we go to options and next steps? Jason.
I have a question. I don't want to open up a can of worms here at the end. First of all, I do also agree with Beth and Lelania, but just kind of as we think about this excess space, kind of how we can be creative with it, how we can kind of also partner. You know, we've talked about partnering with the city and with our community, and this could be an opportunity for us to do that. So thanks for raising those points. I just have a question about the K-8 model. You talked about philosophies, and you know, I know that's, you know, maybe a model of previous time, but what is the I know it's a big question, but what is the kind of current thinking about kind of effectiveness, whether that's I don't know if we do that today, if that was an option, but just I'm curious to know more about like the thinking on the K-8 model.
I can't speak to how we got to K-8s in Boulder Valley. I'd have to do some digging on that. In my experience, oftentimes K-8s are ways to, in a growing district, to alleviate capacity without opening up an entire middle school. There is a philosophy, and there is, in other places that I've been, a real, I think, desire for kids not to have to transition from elementary school to middle school in a K-8. Something we do differently here in BVSD is that some kids go to different elementary schools and they go to the K-8 in 6th grade. And so that's a very different model than your entire community. You're going to be a K-8. You're going to be together from kindergarten through 8th grade. I think that there's you know, educators who, you know, if you're not transitioning to a bunch of new and different schools, there's benefits to continue to support. There's a familiarity, and there's a smaller, more intimate environment in a K-8 than, but again, in the other places I've been, the middle schools were 600, 700, 800 kids, right? And 600, 700, 800 kids in middle school is a challenging dynamic, right? You know, when I was middle school principal for a couple of years on accident, I didn't mean to do it. But what happened was the superintendent, when I was in Orlando, had asked me to open up a high school. So I was opening up a high school, but the enrollment wasn't coming in. And so to make use of the space, he said, "You're going to be a relief middle school for 2 years too." I said, "Well, thanks. I wish I would have known that ahead of time." I would talk to kids. They would do the craziest things, and I would look at them and I'd say, "Why did you do that?" And they'd say, "I don't know." And I believed them. There was just something about putting lots of middle school kids. So all of that to say, I think that there's different reasons why people get there. I think that there are benefits, but also when you have small K-8s, what you'll see is less advanced options, less elective options. It's the same issue we're talking about with elementary schools. The smaller you are, more intimate environment, everybody knows each other's name. The challenge is when you're trying to get stretched academically or try to find your space, find your friend group. You know, if you don't have a chorus, if you don't have a band, if you don't have a sport, like those types of things make it difficult in that time where kids are grasping to try to figure out their identity. Okay, board members. So we've got, I'll walk you through this slide, and then we also have this slide on posters, along with defining the problem and defining the goals and the risk and benefits of the next step as a way to take the next hour to really facilitate the conversation, to get direction, get to collective direction from our team. How do we move forward? We've identified the problem. We've identified some of the risks and benefits. There's really only so many things you can do, right? There's only so many moves or a combination of moves that any district can do when they're going through declining enrollment and looking at the potential of shrinking their footprint or not, right? The first thing is you just stay the path that we're on, right? If we try to see how it meets our original goals that we shared, doesn't redistribute students' resources, doesn't generate additional enrollment, becomes more and more inefficient the longer you go along. There's like an exponential factor of that, right? It's one thing to have a couple of one-round schools. It's another thing to have lots of one-round schools. So one thing, you know, so there's efficiencies that then make it more, it will rise up the amount of dollars that we spend per student to contain the things that we're doing, or you begin to start to whittle those away, do different things to try to keep that dollars you're spending per student in each of those kids the same. That's choice one. Choice two is what we did at Heatherwood. There you can introduce or expand focus programs in a school, rename it, rebrand it. If you have enough kids, and if your issue is, and this is used a lot of times when a school's declining because just nobody wants to go to it for performance or for safety or for whatever the reason might be, that's a choice. You can reconfigure two schools. And so say if you had two schools that are a mile apart from each other, you could theoretically think, instead of having 1.5 kindergarten rounds here and 1.5 kindergarten rounds here, we'll merge them together. So all the kids will have 3 rounds of kindergarten, 3 rounds of first grade, 3 rounds of second grade at one school. And then you go and you could do the next school, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. So you bring 2 communities together. It's not necessarily closing a facility. It's maximizing the number of rounds for the efficiencies and for the experience that we talked about. This is this next idea. You know, with our focus programming, you could relocate those programs. You could do a couple things. Some districts would just you might change the location. You could change the location. You could look at a school that has lots of excess capacity, and you could do what we've done with BCSIS and High Peaks, where you have 2 schools in one facility. You could move one of those into another facility. That is something you can do. I think a very popular option as I'm watching districts try to wrestle with this around the country is the next option, where maybe you have 2 schools close to each other, both maybe at a level of rounds that don't provide for the experience you're hoping for. You figure out a way to engage your communities, bring those communities together, build a new facility that can host all the kids, and you can move the kids into one building. That's a popular option. And then the other option, which is you could close 1 or more schools and try to distribute students to multiple schools. And so that doesn't necessarily, it creates efficiencies. You redistribute students. That does not necessarily generate additional enrollment. And I think that depending upon where your community is, you do run the risk when you do that, you could actually potentially lose students. In an environment where we have so much choice and the schools aren't that far apart from each other, I think that that's something that you'd have to be mindful, we'll have to be mindful of as we move forward. So, you know, maybe there's other creative, these are the main moves. These are the main things that districts do. There's benefits to each, there's challenges to each, right? I mean, ultimately what I'll say to the board is we can't stay on the path we're on and continue to have everything that we have for the kids in schools that get really small. There's not going to be the funding to be able to do that. Right? If the direction after this meeting is we just keep the course and we just see how it goes, the less time you have to react to this, the messier it gets, right? And the more challenging it gets, because folks know we could see this coming. Right? And I think there's an expectation as leaders, as public servants, that we keep our eye on the horizon. We understand what unless there's something that I can't even think of that makes family housing more affordable in our community, or that there's this massive uptick in birth rates that would help us 6 years from now, we have a responsibility to think about this, to communicate what's going to be happening and thinking about moving forward. So that's what I'll say about that. I think if it's okay with the board, we would turn this over to Nicole to have a conversation. We have Susan, who's agreed to take some notes for us up on the on our or a parking lot. If there's other things you want to think about, want to know about, we can record risks and benefits if you want to think about that. Or you may be ready to say, like, here's the next thing we think that we need to do as a district, right? And then, or give staff direction, and we can come back with a more detailed plan with a timeline and how long we think certain things may happen. I will say that I want to be incredibly sensitive to the idea of bandwidth and timing. As we, the faster you move, the more bandwidth we need to have. We may have to engage some other individuals if we wanted to go faster. I think that we're standing by ready to partner, assist, and try to create the solutions that our community deserves, so we can continue to incredibly serve our kids incredibly well here in the Boulder Valley School District.
So I have two clarifying questions, and then I think we're going to continue to use a process that we have been doing where we're just going to go around for board member questions and comments. So to clarify, there is a slight difference between closing and consolidating, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. So consolidating 2 or more schools, in theory, would take some schools offline, but you're keeping the populations intact and they're merging together. Whereas how I understand closing 1 or more schools and then the redistribution is, say, like, maybe there's a school in a geographic center and you say, like, that school gets closed and then we're going to redraw the boundaries and redistribute those kids other places. It still takes a school, 1 or more schools offline, but it's how you handle the student population. Is that the
Yes. Yes. The consolidating is, kids, their communities, their neighborhoods, their friends who they've grown up with, who their brothers and sisters have grown up with, right? Merge with another school where they have the same thing and they become one community. And then closing a school would be, we have 5 schools surrounding this one school, right? This one school you just close and you redistribute and you add, theoretically, students to all of the other schools if they go.
Okay, great. So they both, different approach, minimizes the number of schools. And my second question, you started to allude to, BVSD has a history of bringing in external consultants when we're handling big new things. We did it with the reevaluation of the Grad Plus. We did it with UVA. We've done it with all kinds of different things where we bring in strategic plans. Is that what I said? It's something that it's a tool we've utilized before to facilitate change in direction. And it gets a little bit to your timeline and bandwidth question. And you talked about it with sponsorships as well, are there people that we could externally consult with or bring in to help with this problem? Or is that not a situation in which we could utilize experts in the field?
I think the answer is yes. I think where we are in the process, districts do this differently. Some districts bring in somebody to give them suggestions on the way to solve the problem. Like, I don't think that's what we're looking for, right? Depending upon the level of engagement and what the work would need to happen, there are certainly folks who live in our community that do this work, that live across the state that do this work, that could help us if we're facilitating conversations, if we're gathering input, right? It could be if we want to gather input from our entire community, we could go back to a strategy that helped us at Heatherwood. We do some polling, so we know and understand and can better understand what geographical areas are thinking and feeling, and making sure that we have the right information to make those decisions. So those are the types of things I'm thinking. I'm not thinking, oh, I'm going to hire ABC company to come in and they're going to run the whole process and we're going to be spectators. I don't think that's where we are, or would I be comfortable with decisions of this magnitude handing the keys over to somebody who doesn't live here.
Thanks for clarifying that. Since I saw Kitty and Lelania's hands go up first, we're going to go around the circle in this direction. So start with Lelania.
So first, my appreciation to staff for laying this out so clearly. It's sobering and pretty stark. Something we haven't talked a lot about, but is very important to me, is fiscal efficiency. So when I look at options for discussion, as a member of our audit committee and as a person who has to provide input and approve budget, I am not okay with things that do not improve our fiscal efficiency in this budgetary environment, which I expect to get worse. So that kind of takes out, for me personally, allow schools to stay small. I also want to elevate Nicole's point that consolidating schools feels better to me than a closure where we send kids from one school to 5 different schools. Consolidation feels better. And going back to fiscal efficiency, I am not in favor of building a new school to do that. We have a lot of buildings. So an existing school for consolidation, I'm interested in. Relocating focus programs, I think we've talked a lot about that today. I like that idea for an additional reason, which is if everybody from one area is driving to a focus program in another area, we could take some cars off of our roads or have cars drive a shorter distance. I like that for the environment. I also recognize our focus programs are not as accessible to all community due to the fact that they are all located, or most are located right in central Boulder. Grade reconfiguration, I understand less. And I see that the impact on fiscal efficiency is uncertain. So I'm a little more in favor of consolidation than grade reconfiguration, but I can be open to grade reconfiguration if I understand it better. So if staff comes forward with recommendation on that, I'm open to it. The other thing that I would have liked to have seen on this slide, not to be thankful for all the things I have seen, is impact on teachers for all of these items. Because I would believe that allowing schools to stay small, we're going to have a teacher impact that I don't like there. Introduction or expansion of focus programs, I wonder how that is for teachers. If they want to have a new focus or they prefer to have a bigger team. So, I'm going to continue to think about how this affects teachers and obviously students. But my decision-making capacity will also look strongly toward fiscal efficiency.
I also appreciate all of these options that we've been given. And I don't look at it as we pick one. We could do, depending on the region we're looking at, different things in different areas. I agree with Lelania that I think allowing schools to stay small is not going to be the right solution, and that we do have to look at the fiscal impact. Absolutely. I do have a question about converting a K-8 to elementary and middle, because a K-8 is already elementary and middle. So what does that mean?
You would reconfigure if you had 2 K-8s. You could have a kindergarten
okay.
and a middle school.
Okay.
If you wanted to do that.
Got it.
Or
That was not clear to me.
you could take a K-8 and put the middle school, you could consolidate that with a middle school and keep the K-8, make that a K-5.
Got it.
Or you could take a K-8, make it a middle school and merge the elementary school.
Yeah.
So,
That was a piece I was missing because it looked
Okay.
like you're converting something into something it already is. It's just didn't all fit on the slide.
thanks for
Okay.
the clarifying question.
Okay. There really isn't anything else that I would say that Elenia didn't say. But I do think we should be open to looking at regions and maybe doing different solutions for different regions. Boulder has schools that are way closer together than East County does. So it may require different solutions, but I would say anything that we can do going forward, and by we, I mean you all, because I won't be here, but to make sure kids get the best academic experience and, having more rounds is better. I mean, not if infinitely more rounds, but, having schools at a number that maximizes their opportunities. I think to Beth's point about student experience, that's really important. And that also leads to not really small schools because of counselors and, clashes or conflicts between students. The only thing about, and I'm not against K2 or 3-5, especially if they're very close, the schools are physically close together. I just envision families with kids in 4 different schools. If there's a large family, you could have a kid in, kindergarten through second, one in 3 to 5, one in middle, and one in high school. I don't think that would be a deal breaker, but I think it's something to consider. Relocating focus programs. I don't know if redistributing students is enough of a reason to do that. If I were going to be involved in it, I would want to know what is the impact on the current focus if we move it from here to there. Would we see, greater diversity, or, who would we project to lose, and all of that before you just move something. So I would advise that. I'm not at all opposed to consolidating schools if that works well, because the good thing about that is kids stay together. And I think that's the biggest concern among parents when we change boundaries, is about kids staying together versus not staying together. Same thing with the reconfiguration. The kids, at least in the same cohort, will all be together. So I don't think I have anything else to say about that. So I'll leave it.
And I get the sense that there is going to be a high degree of agreement. And so if we agree, I could say I agree, and then any additional, just because we also still have the 2 questions about how fast and how wide, in it beyond just like what options are up for consideration. Jason.
I wasn't planning to go through each one, but I agree with the comments so far about kind of, we can't, I think the one takeaway from today and from the conversations we've had is we just can't continue on the status quo. And I think that, I don't want to be on the board to kind of oversee kind of ongoing decline for the students and what they're experiencing. These are not fun moves. These are not things that are enjoyable, but I think they're necessary. And I think that the takeaway from today's conversation, from May's conversation, from all the presentations we've had from LRAC, is that we just can't keep doing the same thing. I guess we could, and we would just have a lot of small schools that offer very few services. And that's not what I want for my kids, not what I want for our community. In our some of us who've talked about this in our kind of short, even Nicole, just hearing you say, just in your experience in the school, to go from, you've seen a school, have a massive change from a 4 to a 3. I'm seeing that in my kids' elementary school. We have a incredible counselor who's now split between 2 schools and having to deal with that. We're hearing, all of us are hearing, maybe not daily, but often, about the impact of class sizes. And it's hard to make the connection here with class sizes in this, but I think that's one of the big takeaways, is that we're going to see these things pop up in community after community. And to, I think, Jorge's point and Alex's point, is this is not just a few schools that are dealing with this. They may be dealing with this today, or they're all going to be dealing with this in a few years. And so Again, I don't have particular thoughts. I do, but we don't need to go through them on each of these. I'm just in favor of something that we can do where we can. I think Dr. Anderson said this at the beginning. You know, we're in a position to take action now in a relatively strong position. And I don't want to be one of those districts that takes these actions in a crisis, or as, you know, they're in the middle of a budget crisis, which could happen, you know, any day with the changes at the federal level. And sorry, I didn't mean to jinx anything, but more just, I think, you know, we're in a strong position to make decisions for the future. That's the larger point now. Than in the middle of a budget crisis, when, as neighboring districts have had to do, where they've had to close schools overnight. And so I appreciate all the work that's been done to this point by the staff. I really appreciate the comments of all of my colleagues to get to this point. And I'm, you know, looking forward to the conversation about pace and scope. I don't know the answer to those, but I just, like I said, I don't want to be a board member who kind of sits here and oversees, you know, like I said, the decline of the student experience for our kids.
Alex.
Thank you. Again, I'm really appreciative of all this, and I'm really glad that we're having these conversations. I just want to say up front, in case anybody's getting ready to do their reporting to the community, I'd be really frustrated if anybody in the media or the community came away with the conclusion that the headline should be BVSD reports plans to accelerate the closure of schools. Because that is the last thing that we are engaged in here. We are engaged in discussions about all sorts of things you could do to make the student experience better and keep what's good about Boulder Valley. So I just want to put that out there. I'm really grateful for the staff's work and prep for this. I guess one thing I would say in terms of the thinking about these options, number one is I think that the black bullets could turn into green checks, meaning going from we're not sure how it would work out to feeling like a positive thing from it, depending on how we design it. So I do think there's issues about design and implementation that make us better able to manage the benefits and risks. I also agree that having district bandwidth to work on this, whether that's bringing in long-term staff or consulting and people with local expertise too, is the way to go. I think the stakes for this, the importance of this, are such that we should have the bandwidth to be able to do what we want, to think about this, and in the medium to long term. So it's not like a consultant who comes in for 3 months and helps us figure this out. This is a capacity we need to manage, and we should have it within a district. I do want to point, I don't know if this was clear, but I think one thing to think about, going from like a K6 to a K2 and a 3-5, the main benefit I see there is that you have the ability to maintain those services. And you, well, not necessarily all the services as much as the differentiation and the collegial part between the teachers. So if you have, you'll have 3 or 4 classrooms per grade level when you do that, which allows you to do the things not necessarily about like the number of counselors, but about the ability to differentiate on instruction, to do mixed grouping, to accelerate. So that's one advantage to that approach. And then the kids presumably would go from their K2 to their 3-5. So the cohort of kids and friends is developing through 2 schools. Now, if they're close, that might address Kitty's point about like just making families' lives unmanageable. I also want to say that I think a lens to think about this, I still advocate for a regional approach to this. So I think there is like a superior issue to address, and there's South Boulder trying to figure it out. And each of our different communities sort of are within reasonable, like school choice transportation things, and you're trying to figure out what's available in that community. So I do like moving to a way where we don't say, well, Mesa needs to change, but Bear Creek doesn't. Like it's a Mesa, Bear Creek, Southwest Boulder situation. I also say that one of the things I really do want to think about, and I don't know that it's a new parameter to this, but I do want to ask, does this have potential to increase overall enrollment, to keep and retain families, to attract new families, and to satisfy more families? So how does that change the overall condition of us so that we have more people and we're growing, or at least growing the pie or slowing down how fast it shrinks? And then I do also want to think about what we mean by introducing and expanding focus programs. One of the ideas I've been thinking about is like does the whole school need to have that focus, or can we do a classroom or two with particular focus? So like I keep thinking that maybe we're losing families of kids who are going to private schools, work on dyslexia or early learning problems. And we should have some more classrooms that are focused on early literacy in more of our elementary schools. Or we should have a program that's focused on neurodiverse students. Or we could have accelerated classrooms that are preparing kids to go from 5th to 7th grade. So I like the idea of thinking about like a specific program within a school that also expands the offerings to satisfy and retain more families in that school and takes advantage of the open space. And then finally, I'd say, I think we should need to pay attention to the implications of having vacant buildings when we do close things down, if we ever did. And so there's different things that go on, whether you're mothballing a building, figuring out what the community to do it, how do we deal with, could we make housing on it or something? But there's all sorts of things in our state, in our community, that come from any discussion about how we manage our property. I know we have a great operations team, and I have all the confidence in Rob and his team to help us think through those things. But in the long run, if we were to change how we're using facilities, there are implications that play out in multiple ways for us to think about. So I just generally am super supportive of this conversation. I don't want anybody to misconstrue it as, hey, we're trying to figure out how to close schools faster, and that we're trying to figure out a holistic and thoughtful way about how to manage this. And finally, I'd say, whatever we do here, I do not want to detract from the progress we're making academically at closing disparities in performance and advancing our instructional support and infrastructure that is paying off. That's why we're credited with the distinction. That's why our schools are improving. So I want to make sure that what we do here doesn't make any of that continued improvement, performance, and kid experience be worse. We're trying to make those things continue. So I'll get off my soapbox, but I'm excited about this discussion and eager to talk with us and eager to continue to develop our ability to have deep conversations about it.
Thank you. I want to start by saying thank you to the administration and the teachers for the work on the strategic plan that's happened over the last bunch of years. Because I think that's why we're at where we're at, right? We're serving our students well. And small schools clearly work against that, right? They're under-resourced. They can't provide services. They can't address the more vulnerable populations. We've got to do something different. I appreciate all the options. I think we're all kind of on the same page here moving forward. My one thought is that these aren't exclusive, right? So thinking about consolidation, focus or strand programs at schools, and grade reconfiguration across schools makes a lot of sense. The word that Jeff used earlier was holistic, right? This isn't this is the entire district, not about one region. We can think about how we approach it differently across different regions because the spacing is very different in different areas. The programming is very different. And I think I see this as a chance, as an opportunity for us to make our schools more attractive and think about our programming. East District is interesting because we've got one school that's projected to be 130% of capacity in 5 years, and some that are projected to be at 60% of capacity. So there's opportunities to think differently about those spaces and who we can draw from other districts if we make our schools more attractive. And so I think it's open, right? I'm open to thinking about how we approach this moving forward.
That's why it's really hard to go last in this conversation. Well, you're going to summarize and transition us to the next section. Your job is to really go last. Yeah, I too just want to express a lot of gratitude for the level of transparency this conversation is offering for the board, for our staff, and for the community. I don't know that other districts are having these kinds of conversations. These are difficult conversations, to use your word, Lelania. They're sobering conversations to have. I hear a high degree of agreement around this board. I'm not going to go into summarizing because I'm sure you're going to do that and you're going to do a great job. But for me, I will just add that I agree. Small schools are not, staying small is not an option. That's not on the table. I don't think anyone feels that's the way to go. I also, similar to Lelania, think that we need to have a real focus on fiscal efficiency as we move forward, especially in these times. So I think that it goes hand in hand. Fiscal efficiency goes hand in hand with the programming opportunities for our students. So I'm looking forward to this board having the conversation, without Kitty and I here. However, we'll be continuing to support as much as we can. Yeah, no, I don't have anything more to add other than I think that the relocation of focus programs is similar to what you were saying regarding transportation, but I'm also interested in increasing access to these programs for people around the district. Why are they all consolidated in one tiny space in BVSD? That doesn't make any sense. So, yep, that's it.
I'm hearing a high degree of alignment from this board, and kind of bringing it back to the previous part of our conversation. I don't think there's an appetite to wait an extensive period to begin this work. I think when we're talking about the 2029 numbers and being rather bleak, we can't wait that long. And so I think considering what capacity, considering what timeline, getting all the information we need to know to understand, do we need to bring somebody in to help us work through this, to have some outcomes in the nearer term versus the longer term would be better. I think I'm also hearing the desire, fiscal efficiencies, student-centered opportunities. I think thing we need to think about, what I think about with K-12, the K2-3-5 model, I feel like it's a temporary benefit. I went to schools that I was in a district that was growing quickly. And so I was in a 3-5, or one time I was in a 4-5 school, and then I was in like an intermediate school. Transitioning through, it's a transition. It feels like a really solid transition to help increase programmatic experiences for students at schools that are really close in a neighborhood that might feed into the same middle school, may not meet the long-term fiscal efficiencies. I find it interesting to think about timeline and reality about bond, and I wonder the appetite of our community around, is there a desire, a willingness to pass another bond, to build new buildings, or to improve upon our existing ones or not? That if there's not, then our decisions might be different than if there is, but I think we would need to understand what is the appetite in our community if we move forward this way. To Lelena's point, if we're not building a new building, maybe it is taking a focus school and moving it into one of our big elementary schools, and like rethinking how we're distributing and maximizing our facilities if we're not doing significant improvements. I think having fewer schools allows us some of those operational efficiencies to make our campuses look nicer. I mean, we get a lot of complaints about, man, the landscaping. Why do these rock beds, why are they? I think there are some improvements that if our buildings looked nicer, Rob, I say this, we talk about this all the time. I think there is, if our schools look nicer, we will draw in more students. So I think we're a lot on the same page. I think, how wide do we go? Hearing my colleagues talk about we need to treat each of the different areas a little bit differently means we probably need to look at everybody at the same time. Do we feel like if we're engaging, if we're looking at South Boulder versus North Boulder versus Louisville versus Erie, it's a system-wide approach. We probably want to be thinking of them together. And so the going wide means we look at it all together. Is that what I'm hearing from my board members?
Yes.
And then I really want to tap into something we have not discussed yet and get some board member feedback on is community engagement. I think there's a balance between setting expectations. I'm hearing from the board that remaining small is not an option in the long term. And we know that these types of decisions are only successful when we engage our community in thoughtful, meaningful ways to help us solve the problems at hand. You understand very deeply the problems in your own community, and you might have creative solutions, or you might have just different ideas. So my wondering is, what does that engagement look like as far as timeline, as far as scope, as far as parameters, and how can we do that in a meaningful way to bring the community along? Dr. Innocent.
I appreciate the board having this conversation and being thoughtful in considering the experience of our kids, all kids, and making sure that we continue to provide this just incredible education for every kid that we have the honor to serve. I do appreciate that, and just wanted to put that on the record. Your community is going to be engaged one way or the other. Let me explain that. Now, how do I see unproductive community engagement around school closures? Looks something like this. District cooks up a bunch of solutions in the background, considers some things, rolls it out to community, gives them a little bit of time to, how do you feel about it? And then plans to press forward, right? I haven't seen that go well at all. And then I haven't seen it go well from just a community satisfaction, the level of mistrust that gets developed in a process like that. And then ultimately, because the pressure gets so high, that the school district never is able to roll out the plan that they originally proposed. So I do believe that there has to be some genuine community engagement around what folks' feelings and understanding the parameters the board has clearly set today. Right. So, and we've done this before around really hard decisions, right? But we've done it in a way where folks really aren't talking about some of the really hard decisions we've made in my 7.5 years here. I mean, annually, we're not talking about high school start times, right? Kittyver knows what I'm talking about, right? Board made a decision. We went out, we listened to people, used some of their feedback to land where we are. Kids are getting more sleep. They're performing better. We're able to navigate the challenges. So what I would like as superintendent is to be able to circle back with staff, given the direction, think about timeline. What I'm hearing you say is we're talking about parallel processes in our communities, not this community, then that community, then that community. That's very clear. That's clarifying for us. You do things at once. I'm going to tell you something you already know. The bandwidth and the other things that our team is going to be able to engage in as we think about prioritizing next semester and beyond, we're going to have to consider how much bandwidth we have, strategic plan, keeping our eye on the focus, and thinking about how we can reimagine our footprint with engaging community with feedback and ideas and thoughts. You know, you're going to want to know where folks are. If there's a solution that 80% of folks were like, we'll take that one. And board, you've already began to communicate to our community around these are the things that can happen, right? Tonight around dinner tables, folks will be saying, gosh, of all those things, what do we think would work for us? Like that's going to happen. It's happening. How do we engage folks? How do we think about where folks are? And it may not be, I love this and I can't stand this. It might be, all of these are going to be painful for some people. Of those, which is the most acceptable of a series of options, right? Most people would want, keep my school small, keep giving me all the things that you've given me, right? And figure it out some other way. That is not on the table. We just can't do it. You can't continue to compensate people well in a place that's very expensive to live. You can't continue to provide the services that you need. You can't transportation, food service, operations. So I'm going to need a little bit of time to come up with our team to begin to figure out what a timeline looks like. We're going to need to think about how do we engage our communities? What are those options and opportunities look like? I do think that we're going to need a way to allow every family to have a voice in this and not have this activity become the voice of the loud contingent, right? This is why I really appreciate some of the polling activities we've done where we really are able to capture the collective voice in a way that lets us know what folks who participate, what they're thinking. I think that there's some opportunity there. I want to make sure that we have the opportunity to engage in LRAC. How does LRAC help us and support us in thinking through some of these things? What research do we need to do? Right? A review of the literature around some models that we may be thinking about may be beneficial. right? We're just going to want to be super thorough, right? And if we're thorough and if we're engaged and if we listen and if we lock arms and make tough decisions for the betterment of our kids and our community, I do believe that that is the best path forward. So, yes, community has to be engaged. Yes, we're going to have to listen. Yes, we're going to have to make tough decisions. And no, we can do anything, but we can't do everything.
In your fact-finding mission, I'm also very curious. Right before Beth and I were elected to this board, the staff engaged in a feasibility study with some like 10-year projections or more. I'm wondering, I think it's misguided to think we're going to have significant financial wins in anything that we do. There will be trade-offs. Some things will cost more, some things will cost less. But as we're thinking about decisions in areas, considering what are the conditions of schools, what are the what is the size of the property, what is the ability to convert it to something different down the road if we need to. So thinking about our facilities as they exist, not necessarily the programming within them or the people within them, but the actual facilities, and then like what might those trade-offs be, so we can also, I mean, I would hate to, have a community come up with a great idea about how they're going to consolidate into this one school, and this school is like beyond the state of repair, or then, hey, we really have to go out for a bond, or like we need to be mindful of all of that as well. And so I just think tying that piece in would be helpful for the community and the board.
If you don't do that, then you have a facility-driven process. And in some places, that's what you do. We take the facilities that are in the worst condition, right? Those are the ones that you close regardless of what anybody, but you let that be the long pole in the tent. I do think it is an aspect. And I do think that in some areas, it might make sense to consolidate 2 schools into one school, but you don't have one school that's big enough to hold both of them. And even if you had enough classrooms, your core spaces aren't built or designed for that type of a program capacity, right? You see this at Boulder High. Yes, we have the classrooms, but the cafeteria, the hallways, the stairwells, right? So luckily for us, we have some of the best operations folks in Colorado, if not the country. We can build schools incredibly well. We can remodel schools as needed. So yes, I do think that is part of what we have to think through. It is an element, right? And if there are limitations within the geographical areas that we've discussed, you should put them on the table, not after somebody gives you a great idea and say, yeah, but we could have never done that in the first place. That's not fair. That's not how you genuinely engage community. So I do think that we'll have to do some thinking around that. What are the limitations? What are the options and opportunities? Where's the space to think creatively? Where's the space to get real?
Yeah, and likewise, and sorry, and not Jorge, I mean, where our schools are matters as far as how are they accessible to people? Are they on main transportation routes? Are they near? We talk a lot about how Broomfield is part of the reason Broomfield continues to be successful. It's bordering another school district. So sometimes I know we've gotten a lot of feedback about Heatherwood, but to me, Heatherwood, there's opportunity there. It's next to St. Vrain, where so the location is also important to consider. How kids can come to our schools, particularly our choice schools, 100% choice schools. If they're there, they could be placed somewhere that allows more access to people both within and without of our district. So thank you for making sure we're going to make all of that come to light. Jorge.
Yeah, thank you for thinking through that discussion on the last point about access, right, and opportunity in terms of who can access those resources. We mentioned kind of potential required bond that might be needed moving forward, but we have an existing bond right now. So as we think about timeline, are there implications for the work that's begun, that could be started, that's where we are with our bond now? I just want to make sure we don't forget about that as we kind of move forward.
The answer to that is yes. And the train's left the track on some of that work. Just so folks know, I mean, we have to order so far in advance. And so we're going to continue our bond work. But if there's adjustments and things that we wouldn't want to think, we could bring that to CBOC. The other piece that we're going to have to consider, board members, is how do we engage all of our municipalities, right? When you're talking about big changes, you're talking about transportation changes, right? You're talking about if there's a place where we do some type of a consolidation and then you have a facility, right? You're going to have to engage your municipalities in regards to what happens to that. What does that look like? Where are there other options or opportunities? Is there, I think this goes wrong when districts lead with, we're going to save this much money, or they lead with the facilities, or here's the plan. I was pretty intentional with what I said in the beginning, in the sense that if there is the potential you can do some of these things and you could lose students, right? That's why you have to engage and talk and listen. So we're not leading with, we're going to save X number of dollars, although with the districts that we've talked to, and by the way, while we've been planning for this, our team has been engaged with districts across the country on processes. What do you do? What works? What doesn't work? How much money operationally do you spend up front to get into whatever it is you're doing? And then how long until you recoup those dollars on an ongoing basis? What does that look like? So we have a good sense there, but I do think engaging our municipalities as well as part of this timeline, like how do we start to let them know what's happening? And with the understanding that, this is the decision of the board, right? We're moving forward with this, but there's opportunity for partnership and collaboration, I'm sure.
Board members, we're hearing a lot about timeline. I'm wondering how soon you could present a potential timeline or trade-offs for having a timeline A versus timeline B to the board. Do you have a sense of?
Well, the first thing I think about is we're going to have a new board here in a month. So, I would think that we would be able to start to think through this over the next few months, right? October, November, December. And then after our prioritization meeting in January with our new board, have this as one of the first things that we begin to talk about in that new cycle. If for whatever reason, after I touch base with our team, that is unrealistic, because remember that we've gotten a lot of new information, we've come to some consensus on some big ideas here. I could tell you, if it's not January, I think it would be February, but then you would have to, I think, use next spring. We got to start engaging and listening and talking.
Yeah, and we are always bound by the enrollment window and the school calendar. And so, if we don't start this discussion until this time next year, it's going to be a whole other. So there's a calendar that we always work through. Open enrollment window begins. And then.
Your direction's been very clear. I understand.
Any other thoughts, questions? Alex and Jason.
I guess two observations. One is I really appreciate the direction and part of the consensus that I like what's going on. Sorry I can't be there in person to give you more facial clues, but I'm on board with what we're doing and in support of all my colleagues' input on this. One thing for me is I really do believe that our academic performance and the results for our kids is job one. And so I'd like this to make sure that one of the things we're integrating into it is how it supports the continued growth and achievement of our kids and the progress we're making on our instructional plan. So I don't want the process to be a distraction from that, and I don't want the action to be like a detriment to it. So I want these changes to be in support of our academic mission. Of course, I'm interested in all the other values that we have and are trying to advance, but I just don't want us to be removed from the discussion where we're not also talking about what students are learning. And also on the engagement front, total believer in engagement and having focused and people engaging on the right stuff. So I think it's important to not have engagement in lieu of change, but in support of and to inform that change. So I think we need to figure out the parameters that we're engaging about and give people a constructive, realistic conversation about it that speaks to Nicole's point about the timelines, calendars, things that we're working on. So this is real. This is real now. We need to engage people now with real ideas and real things. And it would be great to have the ability to do that in a deep way, but not take forever as we do that. That's all. Thanks a lot. Sorry to be there in person today.
Just in terms of engagement, I think, go back to the slide that Robin, you presented. It's number 8 on the kind of impacts of this. And I think, Rob, you mentioned this at the beginning too. People say, oh, just close the school and that solves this. But I think, for me, at least, when I think about how we've kind of taken on this issue, when we had this presentation in May and this particular slide showing kind of what the impacts are at 3, 2, 1 and multi grade, that for me shifted from like a more of a longer term issue to a real sense of urgency. And I think it helped connect the dots for this issue with the actual impact today. And so as we think about engagement, I think that's missing out there. We understand that because we've seen that, we've had this presentation, we've had this conversation, is what is, it's not as simple as closing a school. Here is the result of our situation. And if we don't do something, this is going to continue. And so tying kind of this slide and this issue to the slide at the end of our different options and how, not necessarily we're going to kind of get back to what you've had, but we will get closer to that. And so I think that is a very important piece in our community engagement, is making sure that people understand the relationship there and connecting all those dots. Because at least, like I said, for me, that was really, where you really see like, oh, wow, this is not a long-term issue. It's impacting us today. And here are the reasons why. And if we don't continue, that this is what we'll see kind of school to school. And so that, as you plan engagement, I know we're down the road on that, but I really think that's an important connection to make for folks.
A big part of this is defining the problem. Right. What do we have to we have to define the problem so folks can know, see, understand the financial issues, challenges, the facility. Like you have to define the problem for folks. You can't assume folks know and understand what we know and understand, what LRAC knows and understands. I think we'll have to spend significant time getting out into our community, engaging with our public and defining the problem and challenges and the limitations and parameters, right? And then once people are informed, they can really engage. Uninformed engagement, right, will lead to a lot of unsatisfied, right, folks who feel like they haven't been heard, right? So if you define the problem first, clearly, we've defined it today, right? Some people will watch this, other people, you have to just continue to engage, right? Defining the problem, I think, is the first step of what we'll be thinking about. And then once you've defined the problem and parameters, then the engagement around knowing this, understanding this, and understanding your community and your family and your, like, where of the solutions, how do we begin to put together a plan that folks can live with and understand why we're doing it.
Piggybacking on the defining the problem, I think it's a great opportunity to leverage our school accountability committees and our PTOs, and having, a couple of them get together to understand together what the problem is. Maybe district staff can help lead some of those conversations at those schools. So it's consistent delivery from school A to school B and regional. And I think it could be a really impactful component of the work that they do on a regular basis. Well, board members, Kitty.
I just have one more thing to say, because I will not be on the board making these decisions, but I am going to be joining LRAC, and I'm really happy about it. And it's possible Jeff and I will trade places if he gets elected. And the good thing about that is that as liaison, you can't participate in LRAC, but as a member, I can. So.
Thank you for your willing to stay engaged in the district in that capacity, Kitty. Your expertise will be of extreme value there.
I hope so. Yep.
Staff members, thank you for this outstanding presentation today. It was great to kind of this next really important step to clarify for the board and for the public about where we are, where we're headed, it was outstanding. Thank you, board, for the conversation, for your willingness to just go around the circle and chime in, even your hand wasn't immediately raised. I think that helped us all understand where we are all sitting in this conversation and this very important topic. And with that, our meeting is adjourned.